Global Affairs Canada, GAC, personnel were instructed to work from home. At the same time, many embassies and missions abroad were stripped down to essential staff, with officers and their whole families suddenly uprooted and sent back to Canada. This was a strange kind of consular crisis, triggered not by war, not an earthquake, a hurricane, or political unrest, but by an unseen, constantly changing source of anxiety, COVID-19. We've all experienced this anxiety in some form or another in the last few months. But imagine all those Canadian citizens, their friends, their families, in every country in the world. They were told to come home, and many could not. Or maybe the realization only dawned on them later that perhaps they should have paid more attention to that unprecedented travel advisory and that they should consider making plans to return. Meanwhile, no plan remained constant. Airlines canceled flights. Cruise ships were turned away, wandered the seas, or were docked and put in isolation, while people on board sickened and some died. Some countries closed their borders overnight. Also overnight, some banned internal travel. This was the collective anxiety of Canadians abroad. The airways, news, and social media were suddenly full of Canadians who were trapped and demanded support from their government. It's never easy in a crisis, and I guess that's why it's a crisis. For starters, the government of Canada would not necessarily know where all these Canadians were. At any one time, there may be up to 2 to 3 million Canadian citizens living abroad. Although there's registration for Canadians abroad at a website, travel.gc.ca, what we have seen is that most Canadians don't read the travel advisory, nor do they register. The usual pattern is that a small percentage of Canadian citizens register initially, and then more and more register as the crisis deepens. In Wuhan, for example, there were a handful of Canadians registered, literally 5. And that number grew daily into the hundreds as Canadians and their families began to understand the situation. In India, for another example, the numbers grew exponentially. At last count, 12,000 Canadian citizens have been repatriated from India. So logistics are always the key issue in any repatriation. How to get from A to B and then to Canada. And of course, what happens in between depends on the vagaries of an individual. Some change their mind. Some get lost, some are stopped. The situation is fluid. Persistence and creativity are the keys to success. For example, how many phone calls do you think are required to ensure that one Canadian citizen makes it through multiple roadblocks on the way to a designated airport? You will have done already in advance all the preparatory work to get that airport open. You have a plane, it is coming, and you have certified that this person can go on that particular plane. Then you need to know when that Canadian is traveling, sometimes in real time, where the roadblocks are, who is at the roadblocks, why they are there, and what the sensitivities and possibilities might be at every step of the way. Then you make a plan, and another plan, and another plan. In other words, logistics entails diplomacy. Diplomacy involves teams and international cooperation. Luckily, diplomats lean towards team innovation and international cooperation, especially in a crisis. So Global Affairs Canada set up rolling shadow embassies, using people at posts and at headquarters and across the world for a 24/7 operation that followed that Canadian through all those roadblocks. Airlines found new partners as the government implemented commercial backstops. The airline would recover the full ticket price from the passenger, and the government would step in if the flight was under a certain percentage full. The Canadian government contracted partners such as the Red Cross, who deployed to Japan to accompany hospitalized Canadians who spoke no Japanese or English. A loan program was set up almost overnight to fund Canadians who wanted to come home but did not have the money. Also, some countries were evacuating their citizens out of Canada at the same time that our government was evacuating our citizens out of that country. Why not do a two-way flight? What other cooperation with countries might there be on, say, security or health protocols? How would this change each country and our relationship? Tourism is fundamental for every country, but for some countries, it's critical, especially those in the developing world. So each country is specific, each case is unique. So each person has a story, a problem, and a creative resolution on the personal level or bilaterally or in the multilateral context. So the bottom line of this recent experience, no one wants to do this again. The Canadian government should not do this again. Everyone is tired, and it costs millions of dollars from taxpayers. Canadian citizens and their families don't want to do this again. They were told to come home, and eventually most of them did. It was sometimes expensive personally, and their anxiety remains. What will happen if they travel again? So no one wants to do this again, but everyone thinks it might happen again, since Canadians will travel. The cruise industry is taking reservations. The airlines are offering amazing discounts. Families want to see each other. There's work to do, schools to attend, and young and old still want to see the world. So this is what we are here today to discuss. How do you inspire confidence so that we can travel again? And now I'll pass the baton back to Elizabeth, who will introduce Dahlia Stein, who has another perspective from the point of view of public office holders. Thank you so much.
Patricia, thank you very much. Very full and engaging presentation. Thank you very much. And in fact, we have questions rolling in right from the start. So tremendous. And Dahlia, over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just want to start with two caveats. First of all, I have not been in the minister's office during the COVID response period, so I'm not speaking from any personal experience, just my general observations from my 4 years prior in the office heading the consular team. Secondly, unlike my fellow panelists, I am currently a public servant at the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada, so I'm obligated to point out that my comments reflect my own personal opinions, and in no way am I speaking on behalf of the department or the Government of Canada. So now that's out of the way. From a political perspective, I should say that consular is not the first thing that comes to mind when you say you're going to work over at Foreign Affairs. It doesn't usually get the attention or the resources of some of the other areas of the department. But in fact, consular services offer one of the most direct links between global affairs and Canadians. Consular issues can be very high profile, emotional, and consular matters are actually consistently in the top 10 list of topics that people write to the Minister of Foreign Affairs about. Minister Dion once said that the issues that kept him up at night were the consular issues more than the policy issues, although I would say he didn't sleep much at night anyway. So after the activities of the past few months, no one would say that consular services don't matter now. And I know plenty of people who lost a lot of sleep on both the political and the bureaucratic side. As Patricia described, the scale of the activity has been unprecedented, and the government implemented some measures that were almost unthinkable before this. And while the GAC missions and the Emergency Watch Center were taking hundreds of calls, you can be sure that members of Parliament from all parties and provincial counterparts were getting calls as well, and were calling the Minister's office and PMO. Just as officials from across GAC were pulled in to deal with the consular response, political staff were drawn in from a number of offices just to deal with the volume, make sure that no Canadian fell through the cracks, and to help with outreach to airline companies or other critical players. I know for a while there were daily 2-hour meetings every evening with officials where they went country by country, cruise ship by cruise ship, identifying every Canadian needing help, what kind of transportation or other help was needed, barriers to getting them out, barriers to getting them to the airport, and what could be done by the parliamentary secretary, the minister, staff, the prime minister, and others to help. In my 4 years in the minister's office, we were always quite open to using senior level political interventions when it was felt that they would be useful. And when there's a natural disaster or major hurricanes or events affecting large numbers of Canadians, we'd move into emergency management mode along with the department. But the level of interaction in the pandemic response has been massive, both in terms of the wide range of activities and also attention to the smallest details. I saw that Minister Champagne described himself in one interview as the chief travel agent for Canadians. In a crisis, hierarchy does get flattened. There was political involvement in everything from the operational details, such as ministers calling airline company CEOs to help arrange for flights, to diplomatic outreach, as Patricia mentioned, included ministers calling international counterparts to get them to open airspace to allow Canadian planes to evacuate Canadians, to also devising new funding programs to helping Canadians with the unexpected travel costs when they started hearing from Canadians who couldn't yet get refunds for their canceled flights, but needed to buy seats on new ones. So this COVID situation is really a reminder that the government isn't the only actor in this field, but there are some things that only governments can do. And one of those things that I wanted to talk a bit about is the important role of government in providing information to Canadians. So Canada has a very sophisticated travel advisory system, which most people ignore, other than insurance companies, they don't. We are now in a COVID-19 world where you don't know if you'll be allowed into a country, whether you'll have to be quarantined, tested, tracked electronically, and whether you have to go through all that again when you come back. And these things vary by country, and they could change daily. So this is a time when government information and advisories could be crucial. Could government go a step further beyond sharing information to actually verifying or validating that information? Or maybe identify third parties or standard setting bodies that could verify the safety and cleanliness of key tourism destinations for Canadians. As Patricia mentioned, there are a number of tourism destinations that are very important to Canada, important developing countries whose economies depend on tourism. Should government take an extra step to help enable Canadian tourism? The situation does raise some important questions that those of us who've worked in the consular field often grapple with. What can government do to help? And what should government do to help? While Canadians often approached us about helping their loved ones in difficulties abroad, we also heard from Canadians who felt that taxpayer dollars shouldn't be spent protecting people from their own decisions. So there's a balance to discuss. And it's something to keep in mind as we consider the unprecedented efforts that have been made and the new expectations that may emerge, even as we consider how consular services can support recovery in a COVID world and how it can help uphold Canada's values and interests. And I think Bill is going to talk a little bit more about that now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dahlia, very much. And Bill, over to you, please. I believe, Bill, your mic is, it's.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Again, please. Yeah, I'm afraid you were muted for the first part.
No problem.
Thanks so much.
So I want to make the point that we're on an uncertain journey with no signposts, no Google Maps, no agreed standards or conditions. Even within jurisdictions that have common policies, such as the EU, they have conceded in their recent action plan for reopening tourism that the decisions are going to have to be made often at local or regional level. And of course, here in Canada, we see that happening within provinces and between provinces, as each jurisdiction seeks to come up with the best means to allow people to move again. Safe travel and tourism are critical, especially for Canada. And for us, it has two particular dimensions. One, the United States, our longest border, our closest neighbor, and the rest of the world. And whatever solutions we come up with need to consider those two dimensions to our approach. The communities in Canada that depend on tourism, and they're found all across this country, are looking for ways for us to be able to become once again a favored tourist destination. But all Canadians have a stake in the free flow of people and goods. Students, immigrants, seasonal workers, entrepreneurs, health workers, we all need to be able to have those people coming to Canada and have the ability to travel elsewhere. All of us depend upon travel and tourism in one way or the other. But let's consider the impacts on countries that have much less diversified economies. And these have been referenced by Dahlia and by Patricia, particularly Caribbean island states, but also communities in Mexico and other parts of the world where Canadian tourists are an important lifeline and economic driver. It will be important for our relationship with these countries and in fulfillment of our own development objectives that we're able to restore safe tourism. Canada's standing in the world is a product of our engagement with the world and our support for international institutions and the international legal framework. The extent to which we can be seen as a leader and inspiring confidence, getting travel and tourism back up on its feet, that will enhance our reputation in the broader world. Specifically in terms of consular services, Canada, through Global Affairs Canada, has shown leadership. After the Lebanon war in 2004, Canada had invested a great deal of money in building up our consular services and the apparatus of the department to better serve Canadians abroad. The Government of Canada, through the creation of initiatives such as the Global Consular Forum, which brings together 35 countries from across cultures, across continents, across politics, different levels of development, has sought to improve the standards and conditions that apply to all citizens when they get into trouble abroad. Through our support for the Hague Conventions, we have helped to create new tools that are vital in resolving issues important to consular clients, such as the issue of cross-border child abduction. Global Affairs Canada, through its consular services, is a key player in the world of travel. Here in Canada, as partners with the marketplace, with service providers and insurance, transportation, hospitality, with civil society, and of course, within Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada works closely with other departments and agencies, from justice to health to CBSA, etc. So what can we be doing to facilitate a return to safe travel and tourism? I think there are some lessons for us from the 9/11 attacks. As time has passed, perhaps some of us have forgotten the dramatic impact of those attacks and the fact that those impacts did not just last for days or weeks or even months. They lasted for years. We faced a world of uncertainty, unpredictable attacks. With war and conflict continuing in different parts of the world, more people felt afraid to travel. So governments acted quickly and decisively in certain respects. For example, Canada created the Canada Air Transportation Safety Agency. And that agency took over the mandate to ensure that Canadians who are getting on planes know that they will be safe. This was an action mirrored by other governments all around the world. And as well, governments worked more collaboratively in sharing intelligence about where the threats were and ensuring that information, including through consular advisories, about what travelers should be doing to keep themselves safe. Governments started sharing intelligence more widely, not just within government, but with partners outside government. Based on these lessons, I would say we have to look first at governments continuing to work across borders and within governments. Within Canada, the federal and provincial and even municipal governments need to work together to think about how we can assure Canadians that they can move across borders and assure visitors that they can come to this country and get to their destinations. We may need to create new mechanisms for collaboration specifically on travel during a time of the pandemic. The point has already been made before that communication is vital at a time of uncertainty. We need timely, authoritative, and accurate information that is specific to the issues related to travel. And this needs to come from a source that integrates information and intelligence from various government agencies and needs to bring the private sector and civil society into that. The government should be setting out plans for the reopening of travel. From what I can see, the European Union is one of the first to do that. And they've set out an action plan with some guidelines, and it's something that is evolving over time. So that's something that helps to give people an idea of the approach that needs to be taken. We need to work with the private sector and with civil society on specific elements. One is, what are the measures that can be taken to provide assurance to travelers during the period of travel, when they arrive and when they're in their accommodation, and when they seek to enjoy the amenities of the location where they've gone. And we've heard lots of different ideas and innovations that are coming out. So to what extent do those measures need to have some kind of authorization or verification from a standard setting body? It could be a private sector one, or it could be government. Who's going to verify? Who's going to provide the oversight? And finally, who's going to enforce any of the standards that are set down? And of course, as new innovations are developed, whether in terms of antibody testing or new means to make sure a plane is not breeding ground for more germs, governments are going to have to be there to certify any of those new innovations. So I think we need to consider, what should government role be versus that of the market? Dahlia referred to the fact that in the consular world, we're always conscious of the fact that we are not going to become the insurance industry, insurance provider to Canadian travelers. That's for the marketplace to do. But we need to figure out, where does a marketplace begin and where does a marketplace end, particularly in this environment of a pandemic that is likely to see some different waves and different threats. What types of incentives or subsidies are most effective at different phases in a pandemic? For example, I noticed in Italy, they are providing vouchers to low-income Italian families that they can spend in Italy on travel and tourism. What structural or bureaucratic changes might government contemplate? For example, should CATSA take on some kind of a role with respect to health standards in airports and for airline passengers? This is, of course, not just for the travelers and employees in those locations, but also for Canadian citizens who are rightfully concerned about those who are coming into the country. So these are some of the ideas, and I look forward to having a lively discussion, both online and of course, with my panelists. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Bill, thank you very much. Thank you all three of you for your really well thought out presentations. It really, as we move forward in all of this, it really brings about more questions and answers, certainly. And Bill, appreciate the thoughtfulness of the questions that you posed. And actually, with our audience today, we have quite a number of questions already. So I will get right to the point on that one. I'd like to first of all throw out the question. This is by the president of the CIC Quebec City branch, Pierre Guimont, who's offered the question: is there any assistance that can be offered by provincial governments through their foreign offices? And another question, if I may, posed by a board member of CIC Ottawa. What about the security angle? Abroad, the RCMP and CISAs are often asked to weigh in. Is this possible in such emergency situations with time constraints? And maybe, Bill, would you like to take that on first of all, and then the others can come in?
Well, with respect to Canadian officers, whether health officers or security officers or RCMP, our ability for them to go to another jurisdiction depends on our relationship with that other jurisdiction. So the extent to which we may have agreements with that foreign government, that will help. But of course, in the time of the pandemic, we have to go the extra mile. As Patricia pointed out, as governments closed their borders, it took extraordinary diplomatic efforts to ensure that Canadians could travel to that foreign jurisdiction or from that foreign jurisdiction. The extent to which we can come up with ideas that would allow that travel to happen without personal changes, for example, a travel bubble or safe travel bridge, they will help us to ensure that people such as security officers could go to those other jurisdictions.
Anyone else wish to weigh in? Patricia?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and it's as Bill has said. The thing is, with consular is not a freestanding area. It works with everyone, and the security side is absolutely fundamental, because you're not going to. I mean, in an evacuation, for example, you're not going to put a plane in where, you know, there's a war going on and maybe they're shooting. So you need to know, you need to have a sense of what's on the ground. And also this point about intelligence being so important, and a different kind of intelligence gathering, I think is going to be needed. I know that to some people, intelligence gathering sounds cloak and dagger and perhaps slightly below what you want to do, but it's actually a fundamental part of security, and you need somebody to put dots together from public and private sources and deliver some sort of security rating. In any of the advice that goes out from the Canadian government in their travel advisories, there's a security aspect and there's a legal aspect to it. The security aspect obviously comes from many different sources, and the legal aspect is that once the government gives a travel advisory about some country or some region or some part of some country, that is a signal, and that's a signal, should be a signal to all Canadian citizens, but it's also a signal to Canadian companies that there's risk and that the risk profile's just gone up. I'm also now in my retirement, I'm also on the board of a company called Greenlane Renewables. And we look at, all companies look at risk. And you look at risk all the time. The travel companies look at risk almost constantly, and they show their sensitivity to risk by not traveling there anymore. The insurance company says, for example, in the pandemic, if it's avoid all non-essential travel, you come home or else your insurance lapses. So I think that to look at all of these things as separate from consular is to have a narrow idea of what the consular effort involves. It involves all those aspects. As we go forward, I think we're going to have to really make sure that we're well coordinated. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you. Dahlia, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just add a point. I mean, both Patricia and Bill mentioned that there is a lot of interaction across government departments, both in preparing the travel advisories or in dealing with consular situations. In some cases, there are quite complex protocols for interaction with the security services and with others. Maybe there needs to be some contemplation of a more complex protocol for other situations. You know, there are certain things that are codified or that maybe we might want to think of from a more general perspective in a COVID world. I know one of the questions was also to do with provinces, and there is a lot of interaction with provinces as well. Generally, when there's a major emergency or when there's a high profile case, Canadians contact their MPPs or their MLAs in the same way that they contact their MPs. They don't make it a distinction necessarily between federal and provincial. And the provincial governments are always trying to get information, see where they can help. And so, you know, that's another area where we can talk some more about what provincial governments could do in providing consular services. Sorry, that was my daughter.
Oh, great. Thank you, Dahlia, very much. Another question about travel advisory and the self-isolation required upon returning to Canada. The question is when they expect whether there's space for bilateral agreements in EU countries. Sorry, just a second. What requirements need to be met to lift the travel advisory? And when would they expect such a decision to be met? And the other question is whether there's a space for bilateral agreements with EU countries to that effect, and what's the specified body that's responsible for taking such a decision. Who would like to start with that one? Bill.
Well, I read recently that France and Ireland, for example, lifted a 14-day quarantine requirement between them, based on conditions that I don't know if they ever publicized what those were. But the way that the EU is approaching it is to look at what are the epidemiological conditions in two respective jurisdictions, what is the extent of testing, and what is the extent of contact tracing and the capacity for contact tracing. So those are the kinds of things that governments are looking at in order to provide reciprocal treatment for others. We don't have that in Canada yet. So I would say we're a ways away. Maybe we'll have a safe travel bridge between Newfoundland and New Zealand, both of which have virtually no cases, will have had no cases for weeks. But we'll have to be thinking imaginatively.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Patricia. Sorry, you're muted. You'll have to start again.
Well, Bill, I understand why you want Newfoundland and New Zealand. I mean, you being a proud Newfoundlander. Yeah, I think given the Canadian experience, where it's very regional, I can only think that we're going to be lifting it carefully and regionally. I think that's going to pose a lot of challenges because if you look at airline routes, they usually don't go to all the regions. In Canada, for example, you have a few major airports, you know, one of them being Toronto and the other, you know, another being Montreal. Well, those are, at the present time, those are difficult places. Maybe Edmonton would be better, or Winnipeg, you know, have relatively fewer fewer cases. So I think this is something where, again, you know, the market aspect might drive us, but at the same time, the health protocols, the kind of protocols that both Bill and Dahlia are supposing that we might look forward to, those are going to have to be worked out. And if they're worked out between countries, that is going to be extremely complex, and it's going to require the kind of deep, detailed negotiation. We're not part of the European Union, so we don't have an initial base. So we would have to look at countries that we have excellent cooperation with right now, and an excellent level of trust, I think is the word. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. I now have a question. Should the Canadian government proactively promote safe tourism for Canadians wishing to return to the Caribbean and other major tourism destinations dependent on this sector? And it does also bring about the EU discussion, but who would like to take that one on? Bill?
You know, I think it's a natural for us. The island states in the Caribbean look to Canada, not just in terms of tourism, but education, seasonal workers, the to and flow of people between the island nations and Canada is really significant. And I think that there would be an opportunity for us potentially working with the EU to ensure that destinations in the island states are safe for Canadian tourists. Australia and New Zealand are looking at this in their own backyard with the Pacific Island nations. And I think it makes sense for Canada to take the lead similarly in the Caribbean. The EU has for a long time been involved in improving standards of safety at tourism destinations in the Caribbean for their own citizens. So a triangulation with the EU, the Caribbean nation states, and Canada, in my mind, would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think long history, diasporas here in Canada, i.e. personal connections. Also, we built, you know, through various programs, we built most of the airports all through the Caribbean, and we are traditional clientele. We go all through the Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, into you know, the Bahamas, the Barbados, so Jamaica. So I think there is a real opportunity here, and also we are looking for a seat on the Security Council. And the Caribbean countries have been very supportive in the past when we've been on the Security Council. So and each of those countries has one vote. So I would say, I think it's a good opportunity.
And I would add to that Canadians are going to go anyway, probably. I mean, you know, there's a lot of pent up desire to go places. If there are, you know, some cheap flights somewhere, a lot of people are going to go, and we're going to end up having to deal with them one way or another. So to the extent that government can try to ensure there are some protocols in place and safety standards in place, some way to verify that, some way to share information about that, it's probably going to end up saving time and effort on the back end if we do it on the front end.
Yeah,
and that's
I think the real challenge for Canadians and Canada and the Canadian government, obviously, and all the travel industries, is the U.S. It's where we go most, but it's in a different place, and we'll have to tread very carefully.
Look, the other point to remember is Canadians may want to go to other destinations, but are we going to let them to come back into the country without imposing requirements on them that they would find too much and too onerous? So it works both ways. It can't happen that one country decides they're going to open their borders and allow people to come in. Italy is doing it as of June 3rd, by the way, whereas the rest of the EU says June 15th, unless the country from which they came will allow their citizens to come back without imposing all kinds of burdensome restrictions on them.
Mhm. And the island countries that we were talking about previously, they would have to think very carefully about opening up, because things would spread quickly. So there, and exactly, it's going to require mutual trust and confidence.
Mhm.
So this is where, you know, government is going to play a really significant role, because there has been this ongoing debate about what are the ways in which you can ensure that people are safe to bring into your country. The idea of a passport, health passport, from what I have seen, scientists have said, look, there's no way that that's going to work, because you can't provide any assurance that people who have the antibodies are perfectly safe. So we're not going to get away from instant COVID tests and contact tracing. So those are going to continue to be there. And of course, as Patricia just pointed out, the island states are going to have to be assured that people who fall sick are either going to be able to be looked after within their own facilities on the islands, or that there's going to be a means for them to get back to Canada.
Mhm. Bill, thank you. Patricia, you have?
Yeah, I was just going to say that what seems to be coming out of this pandemic is the understanding that really we are all in this together, that you cannot buy your way into safety. You can to a certain extent, but it means further isolation. But that really you have to bring the entire society up to a certain level. It's called public health for a reason. And in this case, COVID-19 seems to seek out the weakest part of the society's fabric and burrow in and erupt. So you can't have, you can still have weak parts, but you have to be able to know that they're there and know what's going on. So I think that the idea that you're going to be able to individually say, I'm okay, I can travel because I've got X money or a special passport or something. This is not going to fly. It just won't. And I think we all have to come
Literally.
to some literally agreed. And so therefore it is really a question for travelers. And maybe you can't be a tourist anymore. Maybe you can't be spur of the moment, carefree. Maybe you've got to really do your research and undergo, be prepared for what might happen.
Thank you, Patricia. We're going to be putting up poll questions for the audience, and I would invite you to answer the questions. There are two. One is a yes/no answer, and the second one offers options. And we will, if you wouldn't mind answering this over the next 5 minutes or so, then towards the end of our discussion, we will be able to let you know the results. So thank you very much for that. But in the meantime, here's another question. We were talking about the Canada-US border and whatnot. Given the current situation in the United States, what would be required to reopen the border, and what type of travel advisory would be required? Who would like to take that one on?
Well, I think Patricia made the point that the U.S. is, vast, right? I mean, and the situation in the United States is very worrying and very different in different parts of the United States. So if we were to issue travel advisories, then we need to think about whether we can do that on a state or regional or sub-regional basis. And we mustn't forget the border communities. You know, these are the ones that are most affected on a day-to-day basis, and they will want to have special considerations for their circumstances. So I think we have to look at the border communities as distinct from every other part of the United States. And we have to work with provincial, regional, local level governments to determine what the approach should be.
I'll just say I was doing a little digging around, and I looked at StatsCan. For 2019, there were 56 million trips abroad by Canadian residents. 44 million of them were to the US. 3/4 of that was by car, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
And 21.5 million were same-day trips. So that tells you a little bit about the type of travel that we're talking about. And it may be that focusing on border areas there might have to be certain things that you do in conjunction with the provinces and states, or it helps you to think a bit about what you might be able to do that's beyond just a generic travel advisory that we put out on the website.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we already have an architecture for that, in that the governors of, say, Cascadia, which is the West Coast, they meet together. They have a special relationship. In this pandemic, we've seen that they've been more or less on the same track. Likewise, you have, the Eastern Seaboard and then the Great Plains and the Prairies. But the governors and the premiers already do talk a lot in formal and informal ways. And I think that as we move forward, and as, for example, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba open up more, they're going to be looking south to see what their counterparts along their borders are doing. And they will have input into any of those decisions. I mean, one of the great things that we've seen come out of this pandemic, there are some good things, is that you're seeing a lot more almost daily federal provincial cooperation in a way that's real and I hope lasting. And this sort of question about how do we reopen that border that is part of almost a Canadian DNA is it's going to be very difficult, but we're going to have to look at our premiers. As Bill has mentioned also, I think municipalities are going to play in this, because we've seen that municipalities have been places that are hardest hit because of the density of their population and the density also of interaction. Again, it comes back to the point where this is going to be complex and it's going to be huge, but I think we can do it if everybody agrees to work together. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Question that given that we may expect a second or potentially third wave of COVID, is it too early to be ramping up tourism? And also to that effect, should the Canadian government take responsibility for pandemic-related health security health security by expanding the mandate of CATSA or through another agency? Who would like to start on that one?
Well, I'll just say that, I mean, obviously, given that we know that there may be a second or third wave. And so all of the things that we're talking about here about helping create some sense of security about travel depend on there actually being a sense of security, actual secure travel. So I think it's, all these things we're talking about are probably premature in at a time, like for the next few months, when we're thinking that that it's not dealt with properly yet. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know internally. There's a lot we don't know in countries around the world. So I think we're trying to think about structures that we could put in place, things that we need to consider as we consider future travel. But you're quite right that we shouldn't discount, like this shouldn't assume that as of, next week, things are going to go back to normal.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is the world is moving on, right? We have jurisdictions already looking at creating travel bubbles and travel bridges. The Baltic states, for example, have created a travel bubble. So the world is moving on. We need to be part of that discussion, and we need to learn from that discussion. And of course, the threat of second and third waves is what makes this an ongoing challenge where government needs to play a role. It's not something the private sector can do on its own. It's not something the Canadian government can do on its own. So that's why I think we wanted to provoke that discussion today and to get the thinking going, and particularly get the private sector, civil society partners as part of that discussion, because they're trying to get that travel restored within their own province, within the country of Canada. And all of those lessons are directly applicable to the broader challenge of getting travel and tourism across international borders.
Yeah, and finally, how fast things have happened during this pandemic, from one day to the next. And the kind of criticism that comes as well. They say, well, why haven't they thought about it? Why don't they have a structure? So I think there is real value in thinking through these possible scenarios, or at least, discussing them and having some ideas. Those ideas can change, but you better have some ideas, because this is moving, and it always seems to move fast in this pandemic.
So can I just respond as well to the point about CATSA, Canadian Air Transport Safety Agency, which was specifically created to deal with the threat that we saw after 9/11. We don't know now whether such an agency would be helpful or needed in the context of the pandemic. But it's something that we should be considering, because I think specific to travel, there are elements and considerations that need to be brought to bear that may be outside or in addition to the broader public concerns about the pandemic. And it may be that for the purposes of reassuring Canadian citizens who are afraid of people coming in, or Canadian travelers and foreigners, that we need to have that level of government responsibility and mandate that is specific to the pandemic and to crossing borders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bill, and others very much. Just a question about testing, and wondering whether there are any discussions in government at this point as to which kind of testing would be reliable and quick, such as a test that could be administered at the airports for this virus that would make international and domestic travel safer. Does anyone have a sense as to what's being undertaken in that respect?
Well, I can say, reading about Iceland, which is the country that has done the most testing of its population, 13% of the population of Iceland has already been tested. They are opening their borders, and their proviso is you have an instant COVID-19 test when you arrive, and you then also have to download an app for contact tracing. So, they obviously think that they found the right kind of test, but I don't know whether or not Canada is considering having something of that sort.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? No? Okay. We have the results of our poll to share. Question 1, should the government of Canada play a significant role in inspiring confidence in travel and tourism? An overwhelming yes. 94% of our group say yes, the government of Canada should be playing a role. And the second question, what options should a government include? Subsidies, not so much. Safe travel bridges, travel bubbles, yes. CATS-alike agency, yes. And promotion endorsement of third-party verification of safe travel destinations, which had the most percentage at 68%. So I think that that in itself is, I think, a most helpful indication of certainly our listeners' perspective and of a pan-Canadian view, because we are, of course, broadcasting right across the country. So thank you all very much for partaking in that. I'm just wondering if, yes, Bill?
I noticed that they shot down the idea of a CATS-alike agency. The one point I'd make is, and Patricia made it earlier too, we have been bamboozled over the past few weeks by the speed in which this has moved and by the way in which governments and people have reacted to the pandemic. So that's why I don't exclude anything and why we should be prepared to think about something that at the moment looks, outlandish and an overstep by government. But we may end up getting there if this pandemic goes on for months and years and goes through different waves.
Well, I would add to that I think that's why it's so important to have a conversation that involves not just government, but also the travel companies, travel agents, insurance companies in particular, because believe me, they're thinking about all of this as well. And they've already started to take some decisions that are affecting Canadians. But it would be very interesting to have a more in-depth discussion about each one of those options and maybe some others that we haven't mentioned today from the people on the ground who are dealing with this changing circumstances every day. Because there may be, I don't know the government's at a state yet where it's doing some lessons learned. I mean, it's kind of the expression that I've heard is sort of building the plane as you fly it, which is no pun intended. But that's kind of what's going on. And I think maybe some further discussions with different kinds of people around the table. I'm hoping that will be, government can convene that, bring the provinces to the table, bring organizations that support Canadians, snowbirds associations, understand what the needs and intentions are and how the various elements of industry are planning to deal with that, and maybe come to some kind of shared suggestions. And maybe it will be in the CATS-alike agency. Don't worry, Bill. Yeah. I think 61% versus 68% didn't mean that they shot it down. It was up there.
That's not statistically significant.
Yeah.
It was guarded, yes, Bill. It was very guarded, yes.
Yeah. So I think we all agree that the next CIC roundtable on this should perhaps be the travel industry, talking about what their perspective is. I think that would be great to have the travel industry, blue skying a bit.
Yeah.
If I could say, it was so typical Canadian, right? We start with what role can government play, and then we get around to what can everyone else do. Yeah. I was watching Fareed Zakaria on CNN did a whole in-depth look at COVID and what the new COVID world looks like. He had a segment on travel. They had a big discussion about what it could look like. Not once did anyone mention government. The word government wasn't even, mentioned. So we're being very Canadian today.
Well, we're reflecting the reality. I'm a Newfoundlander. I'm not allowed to go back to Newfoundland unless the chief medical officer gives me a laissez-passer, right, to get in there. So governments are taking steps that are already having a huge impact on people. And Canadians, as you point out, Dahlia, we follow what government says we should do. So I think this is an area on travel where we need governments to think about specifically the needs of the travel and tourism sector, and specifically think about how they can facilitate a return to healthy travel and tourism. Because I'm afraid that it ends up being kind of something that will happen later on or in bits and bobs. And we've all said This is something that needs to be done in a coordinated way if it's going to work. It's not going to work in bits and bobs.
Mhm. Bill, thank you very much. And I'm wondering if any of you would like to have any closing remarks. It sounds like this session is going to be the first of other sessions that are dealing with this subject, and that's absolutely delightful to consider moving that forward. We look forward to that next session. But in the meantime, does anyone have any closing remarks that they wish to make?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, I just going back to what has happened and what that portends for the future. I think that Canadians now might have a better idea of what it means and what sort of effort is required to take them out of whatever situation they might find themselves in. And therefore, I think and my hope is that Canadians will become more thoughtful about travel, that they won't just look at price, they'll look at what the travel company that they're with offers. That I think is really important. Quality, I think, is going to be really important in the travel industry, rather than just the lowest price. And that, I think, is really a good way of using capitalism to keep us safe. The other thing is that we're going to have to look at the question of finite resources. Despite the fact that there seems to be, another program every day, and the government motto is "We've got your back." Resources are finite, and one of the things we're going to have to decide is where our priorities are in this area. How are we going to do it? How are we going to do it the best way? We certainly have done various projects on tourism in many countries, often with marginalized communities. We could do more of that. We can be creative. I think that the government has shown that it can be flexible and creative as they have during this pandemic. So I think a joining of hands with the private sector, the various levels of government, I think would be would give all of this a great push. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Dahlia or Bill, would you like to weigh in? Anyone?
Okay, Bill, no, Bill, you go ahead and I'll go last.
Okay, I just make the point that the government support for travel and tourism doesn't have to be about money. The government's authoritative role as a convener, a standard setter, as someone who can be a catalyst for action. Those are the kinds of roles the key roles that government will play in restoring travel and tourism. And as has been pointed out, part of that too is the unique role that the Foreign Service plays in working with other governments to facilitate the kinds of agreements that will be needed to enable travel and tourism to take place. So, we shouldn't be just thinking about how do we hand out more money. That's not really the main focus of what government will be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Dahlia?
Yeah, as I said earlier, there are government can't do everything, but there are some things that only government can do. And I think that the Canadian government is in a good position to do some of those things and will. I think I want to just end with what Patricia, you started with, which is just acknowledging, we're here talking about the consular response and, the people who have been on the front lines across Canada and our missions across Canada. Here in Ottawa, I know all of GAC, people were taking their turns answering questions of Canadians in the Emergency Watch Center. On the political side, to just acknowledge the crazy life that these people have led for the past 3 months. I can't tell you how many times I have said, thank God I'm not there. So, I really want to acknowledge and honor
Yeah.
the people who have been putting so much into helping Canadians abroad. And not everything is perfect, and we hear criticism, and that's fine. And we can all criticize as well and look for areas of improvement. But to really end with an acknowledgement of the work that people have done to keep Canadians safe, to bring them home.
Yeah, thank you.
Here's to our consular colleagues.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yes, well, thank you all very much. This has been a very important discussion. It weighs heavily on the minds of most Canadians, as how do we return to some measure of a new normal post COVID, and with our demographics as well of moving not only between provinces, as you suggest, Bill, not being able to go back to Newfoundland, but certainly internationally and favored destinations of Canadians, whether it be the Caribbean or the United States, snowbirds to Florida. Or to Europe. So I thank you very, very much for your interventions today. And I thank all those who are listening in for their interest in partaking in this session. And I wish everyone that they stay safe and healthy. And thank you very much. And look forward to the next one, which would bring in the private sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Oops.